Hey everyone, and welcome to our July live event for National Quilter Circle. Once again, we have Toby Lischko back to answer all of your quilting questions. So thanks for being here, Toby.
Hi.
We're so glad you're here to join us. So I know we have a bunch of quilting questions to answer throughout the evening. We're going to be here for about an hour. So if you have any quilting questions you would like Toby to answer, go ahead and ask those into the chat box, and we'll work our way through answering all of those. But I know we're going to get several questions related to the current challenge we have going on right now. So I figure we might as well go ahead and just start with that. So if you can kind of just give us a recap of sort of where we are right now in the challenge.
Okay, we've now finished block 3, I think. No? Yeah. 1, 2,
4.
3, 4. Oh, we're on block 4. Yeah. Right. We're on block 4. And I'm catching up today with block 4 because I've been behind. And I've seen some really, really cool quilts. I mean, the fabrics and the choices and the way people are being real creative and doing their own thing. And I just love seeing what everybody else does. So it's just been a lot of fun, and I'm enjoying it as I always do.
Perfect. Well, so our challenge is 8 weeks. So that means we're about halfway through. So for those of us that are doing the large quilt, we obviously still have a bit more to go, right? But the small quilt, we've pretty much got most of the blocks done. So can you kind of tell us what we're going to sort of preview what we get next week?
Okay, so next week we're going to be able to put that, if you're doing the small quilt, actually if you're doing the small or big quilt, center together. The only difference between the small quilt and the big quilt is the small quilt has 2 borders, whereas the big quilt only has the 1 center border. And then if those who are going on to the bigger quilt, then they'll get some more blocks. And at the end of 8 weeks, they'll get how to put that whole quilt together.
Yes, perfect. And just one little thing that I wanted to say, because I know we saw this question popping up a lot on the Facebook page, is, you know, for the center block and weeks 2 and 3, there were applique options for that block. Week 4, which is the baskets block, is the same in the pieced version and in the applique. So even on the applique quilt, I still used the baskets, because as someone even said, the baskets went perfectly with all of the flowers. So there is no separate set of applique instructions for this week's quilt. It's the same for both.
Oh yeah, yeah, a lot of people were confused because of that. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Perfect. Well, our next question here, this is from Vaughn. And they say, I have problems with the fabric shrinking when I press it. Some blocks are perfect. Some are 1/8 of an inch or more off. Same fabric, same iron. What am I doing wrong?
Okay. Well, blocks don't usually shrink when you press them. Usually if you add a little water or spray steam or whatever, it usually makes them lay a little flatter, which it really makes them a little bigger. So the only thing I could think of, if it's just 1/8 of an inch off, your cutting might just be a tiny bit off with some of the pieces in the block. So I would you're cutting on those blocks. If they are 1/8 of an inch off, usually you can stretch them a little bit with water and steam them and press them out a little bigger. Or you can kind of ease them into the bigger pieces that you're sewing around them. So you can usually ease in if it's only that much off. If it's more than that off, then I would probably end up remaking a block.
Perfect. All right. So I know I have had this issue before, and I'm gonna blame it on the fact that I did not buy necessarily a quilt shop quality fabric, but I have had fabric actually the fabric itself shrink when I press it really hot iron using steam with some water. So is that just because the fabric was lesser quality, or is there, aside from pre-washing, a way to know if that's going to happen?
You know, I don't know, you know, because I've never had that problem before. But I mean, it's true. If you buy cheaper fabric, it doesn't have as much body as more expensive quilt shop fabric, and so it has a tendency to stretch or not work as well. And so I mean, it's possible, but if you pre-wash everything, then it shouldn't happen. But You know, I mean, every fabric acts differently, so you just kind of gotta go with it and kind of figure out what your fabric's doing, and work with what you got to get it to be the right size.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. This is from Tammy, and she wants to know: can I machine quilt and hand quilt on the same quilt, or is it one or the other?
Well, I've actually done both. I did a quilt for the Hoffman Challenge when I was first starting to quilt. And I took it in, I was working in a quilt shop, and I took it in and I was showing people, and they said, oh, you got to add more quilting to it. So it was a block that was on point. So it had these great big triangle corners. And so I ended up hand quilting the corners in it, and then machine quilting in the ditch, and some other little bitty quilting around the border and stuff. So you can do both. There's no right to put together, or to put together a quilt, I should say.
Perfect. So that's a good, brings up a good point. I guess, when do you know whether you have enough quilting? You need more quilting. You've over quilted your quilts. Like, what is a good way of knowing how much quilting to add to a quilt?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on how much. To me, over quilting a quilt means it feels like paper when it's done, because it's stiff as a board. You know, I mean, if you put, and a lot of quilts in competition quilts are over quilted a lot, and they're not bad. And you quilt it as much as you want it to drape around whatever you're using. But to me, the trick is that the quilting has to be even through the whole quilt. So if you have it heavily quilted in the center, it also has to be heavily quilted in the borders and everywhere else. So you have to have an even amount of quilting over the whole quilt. You can't just have some in one place and some in another. And I've made those mistakes where I've quilted more in one area than another, and then the quilt doesn't lay flat. It just kind of waves around, and it just doesn't lay as nice as it should if you don't quilt it evenly across the whole quilt. Perfect.
That makes sense. I like it. All right, our next question here, and this one is going to be hard for you to answer exactly how they've worded it, but I'll have sort of a follow-up that goes with it. But they have a quilt that's about 1/4 of the way hand quilting, and wants to know if you know anyone who hand quilts that might want to finish it, which might be hard for you to answer. So just in general, how does a person go about finding a hand quilter? Because a lot of people advertise that they are machine quilters, right? But how do you find a hand quilter?
Well, usually, I mean, depending on where you live, a lot of towns have churches that do hand quilting. And so I would check with some local churches that do, that do charity quilts and such. And some of them do hand quilting for people, for pay. Note on the grocery store bulletin board saying you're looking for hand quilters, and maybe you might find them that way.
Perfect. Good idea. I like it. All right. Our next one here. Susie says, how do we learn how to use these special quilting rulers while using a regular home machine?
Well, my tip is go to YouTube. Anything you want to learn is on YouTube, and especially with some of these specialty rulers, most of the companies who have these rulers have their own YouTubes on how to use those rulers. And a lot of the rulers can be used either in your domestic machine or your long arm machine. So it doesn't, it's the only difference between the long arm rulers and the rulers you use in your domestic machine is the thickness of the template of the ruler. So the ones on long arms are thicker than the ones you use. Learned a lot of stuff on YouTube. So just go to YouTube, put in the kind of ruler you have or the company who made the ruler, and you can usually find a video on how to use it.
I feel like that's literally could be the answer for any question in life ever, is to just Google it. Like, you're gonna figure out how to do it. But I do want to say, one of our past challenge designers, Gina of the Copper Needle Designs, she does a lot with custom rulers and ruler quilting. And so if you go to her website, or if you're in Arizona and can go to her shop, She does classes in her shop, has a bunch of video tutorials on her website, and I think even on Facebook and stuff too. So she is a great resource for that. And I know she even has like her own line of rulers and templates and stuff. So she has tons and tons of them. So also, I'm sure you can find her by Googling as well. But
Gina Perks? Are you talking about Gina Perks?
yes, she just got married, and I don't know if she changed her last name. So I didn't want to say it is Gina Perks, and it was Gina Perks Designs, but I know she just got remarried, and I'm not sure what her new married last name is. That's why. But if you Gina of the Copper Needle is who, yes,
okay.
is who I'm
I
talking
have
about.
some of, yeah. So yeah,
Perfect.
she's very good.
Yes. All right, our next one here, this is from Barb, and she says, really enjoying the quilt. This will be my first quilt, and I do not have the knowledge yet. My question is, how do you make the quilt bigger than the bed size of 88.5-inch square? I would like to attempt a king size bed, like a 104 by 92.
Okay, basically what you're going to do is you're just going to put, I mean, it depends on what you want to do, but normally I would just put more borders on. Of course, you're going to have your top and your bottom border longer than your side borders, but just add 1 or 2 more borders. Figure out if it's 88.5-inch square, then, and you want it to be 104, you would take that difference and divide it by 2, because you're going to want as much on the top as on the bottom. Or you could, if you want to have a pillow top on your quilt, you can always make the top bigger than the bottom border. So, you know, you just kind of have to play with different, I would draw it out on a grid, start with that 88.5-inch square, and then use a grid, and each each square would be 1 inch or 1/4 inch or however you want to do it, and then that'll help you figure out how big your borders are you want to put on there. That's the best way to do it, is with drawing it out on a grid.
So if you wanted to make it bigger and didn't want to do just borders, could you also just make additional blocks?
Sure, you can always add additional blocks. The only problem with that is with these blocks that are 8 inches each, if you add 8 and 8, that would be 16 inches, then you wouldn't have any borders to put on, you know. So it would be easy, unless you want to make a smaller block, you know, a 4-inch block or something in there. But if you're a beginner quilter, the easiest thing to do would just to be add more borders.
Perfect. All right. This kind of goes along with potentially, here's another fun, easy block you could add to this quilt. It's going to be hard for you to do a demo just like right like that real quick, but you can explain it for us. But Anna wants to know tips on how to piece together half-square triangles to make an entire quilt top. I know how to make them. I just want to make sure as a beginner quilter that I'm doing them right.
Okay, well, there's lots of different ways to make half-square triangles. You could use a grid, or you can just cut triangles. I mean, if you're making a whole quilt, I'd make great big half-square triangles. I wouldn't make like a 2-inch half-square triangle. I'd probably make them 5 inches or whatever. There's a couple ways to do it. Most people like to do it where you start with a square. Say you're doing a 5-inch half-square triangle. You add 1 inch. So you cut a 6-inch square, you draw a line down the center of the square, and you cut 1/4 inch on each side of that line. And then you trim it to 5.5, which would be your unfinished size, because your finished size would be 5 inches. And that's the easiest way to make them. Some people don't like to sew triangles together. Personally, I like to cut them to size, but even then, if you cut them into half, you could still sew them together and trim them down to size. So you could do it either way, whether you want to draw the line or not draw the line. And then you just kind of have to figure out how many half-square, depending on the size of your half-square, or however big you want your quilt to be. 5 inches would probably be a good size. You could use charm squares, 5-inch charm squares. And you could, where you don't have to cut your own squares, just put 2 charm squares together, draw your line, and make half-square triangles that way. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. So I mean, it's endless. There's endless ways to do it. But if you just want to make a scrappy quilt, then just cut your squares and draw your line and sew on each side of the line, and then cut them into half square triangles.
Yes, perfect. And I will say, we on nationalquiltercircle.com, we actually have a fun blog post specifically about half square triangles, which just explains how versatile they are of a block, but actually provides 3 sort of fun alternative layouts. So you can actually make some really fun and creative different layouts with half square triangles, just in how you rearrange them. You know, if one half is light and one half is dark, you can get some pretty cool layout options. So even if you just check that blog post out for some design inspiration, you might find a layout that you want to use or something similar. So check that out. Our next question here: I have quilt patterns from the 1930s and 1940s that have been saved by my grandma and my aunt. How can I utilize them?
Well, if you, I have some old ones too. I mean, they weren't my grandma's or my aunt's, but I did find some old ones from Kansas City Star, printed one in the newspaper every Sunday. And sometimes those, if your grandma or your aunt did them, they might have cardboard templates in them. And I don't think there's anything new in quilting. I think a lot of the stuff we do today is based on those blocks that were around for a long time. So I just take those patterns, kind of figure out what kinds of fabrics you want to use with them, make a block, see what the block looks like when you're done, and use them. I mean, I have some quilts from the 30s and 40s, and they're beautiful quilts. So they don't have the same kind of fabrics we have today, but you know, see what you can do with those old patterns.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so I have sort of a follow-up question to our question previously when we were talking about half square triangles, but this goes along with a question that we've seen a lot even on our challenge group Facebook page. But when can you cut a block oversized and then trim it down, and when do you have to cut it specifically to what the pattern measurements tell you to cut it at?
Okay, now you can't, I mean, if it's a half square triangle, you can always oversize them. You can always cut them a little bigger than you need to, and then trim them to size when you're done. The only problem is if you want to cut everything oversized, then there's times when that triangle needs to be a specific size. So the basket block is a good example of that. In the basket block, I have half square triangles that are cut at 3 inches, and you can draw the line on the back of them, make those half square triangles, and cut them to size. But I also have some pieces that are cut at 2 7/8, and they have to be cut at 2 7/8 because you can't cut them at 3 inches and expect them to fit with the rest of the block. So you have to cut them at 2 7/8. So I know some of you dread that 7/8 of an inch. But there is that 7/8 of an inch line on your ruler. Most rulers have to use 7/8 of an inch. Now, there are a lot of patterns that, you know, may have some odd sizes, and they will say cut 7/8 of an inch. You can't oversize those. They're written that way for a specific reason. So most pattern writers will write those directions for a reason. So if you're confused about that, then you should always, you want to find out why she cut them that size and why you can't cut them, you know, a little bigger if you wanted to. And then she or he or whoever's written the pattern can always explain, yeah, I understand what you're saying about overcutting them, but there's certain places that you need to cut the exact size that's given in a pattern.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like if you are somebody who has only ever cut full inch increments or quarter or half inch, and you've never, you know, done other increments, I mean, there's a reason that there are 1/8 marks on every single quilting ruler, every single quilting mat. Like, it's because those are used a lot. So if you have some scrap fabric, just, you know, play around with cutting a square that's 2 3/8, you know, a 5/8, just a measurement that you're not used to. That way you're familiar with it, and next time you see it pop up in a pattern, it's not going to be this crazy number that you just, you know, want to avoid. It'll be something like, oh yeah, it's just another measurement, I got this, and you just cut it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. My daughter is getting married, and I
just cut it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think we lost you a bit. I know we were talking beforehand that you were having a little bit of weather at your house, but I think I cut you off. What was the last thing you just said there?
I said you can't just cut things the way you want to cut them. Pattern writers write them their patterns for a reason and the measurements for a reason.
Yes. And I like to think that it's pattern designers and writers aren't trying to be complicated. Like if there's an easier way to do it, or you can do it at a whole number, like we will write a whole number in there, but sometimes it just can't be done.
That's right.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. My daughter is getting married and I'm trying to decide on a quilt design. I'm thinking about the double wedding ring quilt. How challenging is this pattern? I don't want to buy it unless I think I can do it, but I'm not sure about curved piecing. I feel like you've got some expertise there.
I do. Well, I made one double wedding ring quilt for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And that is one of the more difficult patterns there is to make, because you're not just piecing blocks together, you're piecing pieces together, and it's like a puzzle. So it is a more difficult. If you're not sure of curves, then I would avoid this pattern, because most people, when I show the quilt and talk about, I do a lecture on curve piecing and I show all my curve blocks, and I do how many of you have made a double wedding ring quilt? And I'll have a few that'll raise their hand, and then I'll say, how many of you are going to make another one? And very few raise their hand and make a second one. So it's not an easy pattern to do. And if you're not too sure about curves, then I would look for something else for a wedding present. And there are other patterns that are called double wedding ring, but they don't look like that. So, and they're more pieced blocks. So I would just kind of do a search and look for double wedding ring type patterns, and you'll find some other ones that are called that, but they don't look the same.
Yes. So just if someone's never heard of the double wedding ring at all, is there such thing as a single wedding ring, or is there only double?
It's only double wedding ring. I've never heard of a single wedding ring quilt. That's just the name of the block.
I know. I just thought, most people think if there's a double, there has to be a single, but so I just thought we'd, squash that. All right, our next question here, Irmgard says, when I buy batting online, it usually comes tightly rolled up in a bag. Is there an easy way of getting the big wrinkles out so that it lies flat when I'm making a quilt sandwich?
Yes, just throw it in the dryer on low heat. Or either low or air. If you tumble it dry for about 10, 20 minutes, it'll get all the wrinkles out. It's that simple. That's for, say, if you have like the big wrinkles that she mentioned, have you ever just pressed your batting? Like if you have just a few little wrinkles or just a couple little bubble spots, can you just press it like regular fabric? I haven't, but I think you have.
I have. But we talked about this once before, and you had some good reasons as to why I shouldn't do that, because it's very time consuming on a small ironing board.
Yeah, it does. If if you have a one long wrinkle through the whole center of this big king size batting, it would take a while to get all that out. So it's just easier just to throw it in the dryer.
Yeah, I'm gonna remember that next time. I don't think I thought of that. I thought it just, I'll iron it. And
I'm always afraid of burning or melting, or I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you can melt it or not. So why be afraid of doing that?
Maybe if it's 100% polyester.
Yeah, if it's 100% cotton, I wouldn't worry about it. But if there's some polyester in it, or I would worry about that.
Okay. Along those same lines, because we were mentioning with fabric shrinkage and all of that, that if you pre-wash all of your fabric, you're going to be fine with any shrinkage or anything that's going to happen. Can batting shrink, and should you ever pre-wash your batting?
I missed your question.
So in terms of pre-washing things, to combat shrinking, can batting even shrink, and is it something that you should ever consider pre-washing?
Yeah, batting can shrink. 100% cotton batting can shrink, and usually on the package it'll tell you how much shrinkage there is. Some say the shrinkage is only 2%, which isn't a whole lot. But if you talk about something that's 100 by 100, maybe 2% would be 2 inches. You know, so usually people wash it after they've quilted it, and it gives it kind of an aged look. So if you've pre-washed everything, then I would pre-wash the batting if you don't want it to have that kind of aged look. But again, you're just going to you don't want to, if you wash it, you don't want to tumble it. You know, I mean, you just want to put it in so it just sits. And then you want to spin dry it. I mean, spin it so that the water comes out, and then stick it in the dryer, because you don't want it to agitate, because then it might pull apart the batting.
Oh yeah, gotcha. That makes sense. Even when you are washing your quilted quilts, do you also not agitate the quilts when you're washing like a finished whole quilt?
I don't. There aren't too many quilts that I wash, only because a lot of my quilts are wall quilts. Those I just tend to put them in the dryer and just get the dust out of them. If it's going to be on well, I mean, the only time I've been washing my quilts is if my dogs lay on them and get them dirty. So
perfect. We have lint rollers galore. All right. Our next question here, what is the best way to begin quilting? I know the very basics of sewing, though to be honest, I do have issues with straight lines.
Well, I mean, I have a couple videos out on how to get a consistent seam allowance. And that's just the key to, if you've done sewing and you've sewn clothes, which would be basic sewing, you can sew a seam. So basically with quilting, you're sewing a 1/4 inch seam. So you need to learn how to make a consistent 1/4 inch seam. And I have a video on YouTube that shows you how to get a consistent 1/4 inch seam. I've done some videos for National Quilters Circle. So if you look at some of the videos that I've done on doing that, and I'm sure there's other ones in National Quilters Circle on how to get a consistent 1/4 inch seam, then you're on your way to quilting. I mean, if you can get a 1/4 inch seam, you can quilt anything.
Perfect. So if you know the basics of how to put 2 pieces of fabric together and stitch it with that accurate seam, like where do I go from there? How do I decide I'm going to make this pattern or this block, or how do I actually take that seam knowledge and turn it into a quilting project?
Well, you look for a quilt in a quilt shop or in a quilt book. I mean, there's lots of quilt books on the market that are for beginner quilters that start with real simple patterns like a rail fence or a 9-patch or something like that. And so you just start with a very simple pattern, and then work on, add to your, every time you do a quilt, just add a little some new technique to each quilt you make, and just build your own techniques, build your skills as you're making more quilts.
Do you remember what the first quilt pattern you ever made was?
Yeah, it was a rail fence.
Perfect. I thought it might be one of those two. And actually, so I believe on nationalquiltercircle.com I know we have a video on an easy rail fence made from jelly roll strips, which are just pre-cut 2.5-inch strips of fabric. And we also have how to make 9 patches, how to make 4 patches. So all of those are those easy blocks that you can, make quickly and put together into whatever quilt pattern it is you want to make. A next kind of follow-up on this one is a question we've had previously in terms of whether it's a sort of a free rights pattern or purchasing a pattern. Say you're going to enter something into a show, and you haven't made up the design. Do you have to say who designed the pattern, or can you just say, this is my quilt, I made it?
Well, no, if you're entering a show, you do have to, and you're using somebody else's pattern, you do have to put on a entry form that it's so-and-so's pattern. You can't just make it and just claim it as your own. If you design your own quilt, then that's a whole different story. If you have somebody else quilt your quilt, you also have to list them on your entry form. So you have to look at the rules of what the quilt show has, and but always list whose pattern it is, or even if you made it you adapted your own quilt from a pattern that you saw or that you made, you do have to say that this quilt was adapted from so and somebody else's pattern and just made a couple little differences to it.
So what is there a sort of rule of thumb on, like, if you changed up 5% of the design, or you changed up a few blocks, like when is it, does it come you know, to just, oh, my quilt was inspired by this picture of a quilt I saw, versus I made this quilt, you know, based off their design, if that makes sense?
You know, there is an amount, and I don't honestly know what it is. I heard somebody mention that if you've made up to so many changes, like if you've taken a pattern and you've made like 5, 6 changes or something like that, then you can call that your own quilt. But if you've only just, you know, changed the fabrics or changed a couple of blocks, you can't call it your own quilt. You know, so there is a specific number, but I can't tell you what it is right now because I don't know.
I don't either. I assumed there had to be some sort of number or percentage, but yeah, I also was not sure about that either. Speaking of shows, if you are somebody who is thinking about maybe entering a quilt into the first show ever, how do you decide which one, or how do you even find a show to enter a quilt into?
Well, I mean, they're usually listed in most of the magazines. A lot of the magazines have, you know, so-and-so shows coming up. There's, you know, I mean, of course, there's always local shows or local guilds that have, you know, but usually those are members that enter their quilts. But, you know, you can enter your quilt in a state fair. He has shows all over the country. International Quilt has shows all over the country. Mancuso's another company that does shows everywhere. So, you know, I mean, I would just get a magazine, a quilt magazine, and look through them. And usually most of those shows are listed in the quilt magazines.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. What does the term shadow quilting mean?
Okay, you know, I'm thinking shadow quilting means the same thing as echo quilting, but I can't.
Oh, so yes, and then our minds went in totally opposite directions, and I have another answer for it. But yes, explain what shadow and echo quilting are.
Okay, echo quilting means that you're just taking the outline of a shape. Say it's an applique quilt. So say it's a rose. So you take the outline of the rose and you just quilting around it, and you just keep quilting around it 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch apart, so that it's like an echo, you know, it just continues to go out and out. Shadow quilting, I know there's a shadow pattern that you have a dark fabric behind a light fabric, and it makes kind of a shadow looking block, but I don't know what shadow quilting is.
So my mind immediately went to, because I've done shadow applique, which is you have your block and you have your applique design, and then you have a piece of sheer fabric you put on top, whether that's organza or just something that you can see through, even a super lightweight muslin over the top of, say, a dark, you know, purple or black shape that you've appliqued, and then you quilt around that shape, and it's called shadow applique because you just barely see the shadow of that shape through that thin, you know, lightweight or translucent topper. So that's how I thought of it. So we have like 3 different options just from the same question. So I love it. We all had different ideas.
Well, I mean, the other idea could be that you take, you know, a side of your block or whatever, and you quilt it dark. You know, you make a lot of quilting on one side to make it look like a shadow. You know, I'd have to look up that term because I really don't know what that means.
I think we just decided it has multiple different answers, and
Yes.
it can be any one of those things depending on your desired look.
Right, right.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. What type of batting should I use, and is one type better than the other?
Well, I mean, to me, it's what I like to use, and everybody has their own preferences, the type of batting they like to use. Some people like to use 100% cotton, and cotton comes in different widths. I mean, not widths, but thicknesses.
Yep.
And I have a favorite brand. My favorite brand is Quilters Dream. They make a cotton, 100% cotton. They make a cotton blend. They make a poly blend. They make polyester, which feels like cotton. The polyester today is I first started quilting, stiff, and it was awful. And then there's batting that's called green batting that's made from recyclable bottles, and there's bamboo batting, and there's all different kinds. There's batting. Quilters Dream also makes flame retardant batting for baby stuff, baby quilts. So it just depends on what your project is for. There's a wool batting, which is a good batting for hand quilting. So there isn't any type that's better than the other. It's really just kind of what you're going to be using it for. And you just have to play with different battings to see what you like. So, to me, the Quilters Dream Poly I like the best because I fold, a lot of my quilts are folded and I travel with them. And that's the batting that does the least amount of wrinkling. Because some battings, when you fold them all the time, they have a wrinkle that's left in the center. And Quilters Dream Poly, to me, is the one that leaves the least amount of wrinkles.
Perfect. So does it also come down to, say you're somebody who lives in Antarctica and you want a really, really heavy, warm quilts versus somebody who lives in Texas and they want, a very lightweight quilts? Like, which one is for which climate?
Well, I mean, if you're looking for something that's gonna keep polyester batting, does not breathe at all, so it would hold the most heat in, whereas cotton breathes. Even though a heavy cotton quilt is going to be warm, it still may not be as warm as a polyester batting because, like I said, it doesn't breathe. Wool batting, you may think it's real heavy and it's going to keep you warm, but wool batting is usually very thin, and it also breathes, so it might not be your warmest batting to use, but you just kind of have to lie under one to see how hot it is.
Perfect. I like it. I want.
You want to use a thin batting, for a warm temperature.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the new part-time job I want, is just quilt tester, where I just take naps throughout the day with like different quilts on top of me, and I let you know how hot I got while I was sleeping.
That's a good job.
I think so. All right. The next question here. So we talked a lot about pre-washing fabrics to combat shrinking, but there's also pre-washing to combat whether your fabrics will bleed or not. So what if you didn't pre-wash your fabric? Can you still wash a finished quilt, or should you not because the fabric might bleed?
Well, I mean, usually I would test a fabric before I put it in a quilt if I think it's going to bleed. And most cottons today are color fast. Even the darker fabrics are color, regular cottons. The only fabrics that I usually test for bleeding are batiks, because the darker fabrics, the blacks, the yellows, the reds, the navies, those have a tendency to bleed. And I will test those and pre-wash those. Most of the other fabrics especially prints, don't bleed because there's so many colors in them. It's color fast. So you can, if you know that the fabric inside is not one of those fabrics that's going to bleed, you can certainly wash it afterwards. Washing your fabrics before you quilt is a personal preference. Some people swear by it. They don't even put a quilt together unless their fabric's washed, and some say I don't wash anything. So it just I used to wash everything the minute it came in the house, and now I don't wash anything unless it's a batik.
I also don't pre-wash anything, and it's because I usually, 90% of the time it's because I trust the fabric and I don't think it's going to bleed. 10% of the time I'm just kind of lazy and I just want to, get right to the project. I don't want to spend the time to pre-wash and things like that. But so you mentioned testing a piece of fabric. How do you test your fabric first to know whether or not you need to wash it?
You just stick it in some really hot water, and then you let it soak for about 2 to 3 minutes. And if the water turns a color, you know it's going to bleed. Or if you pick buy one of those fabric, those dye catchers at the grocery store, just stick in the washing machine with the fabrics, and it usually catches the dye from the fabrics. But if it's a really dark fabric, I would probably wash them a couple times, because sometimes those black dyes take forever to come out of those fabrics.
Right. So I know you don't pre-wash your fabrics anymore, but I know we've talked about a lot this before on some past live events and stuff, in terms of some prep that you have to do if you're washing a fabric, pre-washing a fabric like flannel, which would be to stay stitch around the outside edges because it ravels a bunch.
Right.
Do you have to do anything at all with your regular quilting cotton?
No, you don't have to do it. I mean, I know people who use their I'm seeing your moment here. They edge off their fabric.
Oh, pink it. They pink off the edge.
No, they sew an edge on all their fabrics. You know, the serger. They serge the edge of all their fabric.
Okay.
And I think they do that before they wash it, because they don't want it to shred. But the only fabrics you really need to wash, you do need to wash flannels, because they shrink a lot. The cheaper the flannel, the more it shrinks. Even though it's a little stiffer if you don't wash it, but you do really need to wash flannels before you sew on them.
Perfect. All right, next one here. Do I use a back stitch when sewing my blocks together, or is it not necessary?
It's not necessary, because all the time, anytime you sew a seam, you're sewing another seam over it. So you're crossing your seams, so they're always they always lock each other when you do that. So you don't have to. Now, I know some people, I've watched videos of people in England do quilting, and they do backstitch. So I don't know why they do backstitch and we don't in America. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or what, but I mean, you don't have to. You can if you want to.
So the only time I backstitch is if I am attaching the block that's going to be on the outermost edge before I put my final border on. I backstitch on the edge that's going to be up next to the border. Do you do that at all, or anything like that?
No, but it's a good practice to do, because a lot of times if that quilt top is sitting,
Oh, I think I lost you for a bit.
Oh, what'd you lose me?
I lost you. Last thing I heard, I know we've got some weather issues on your end that we're still dealing with. Hopefully that storm passes over you soon. But the last thing I heard you say is if your quilt is going to sit for a bit.
Oh yeah, if it's going to sit for a bit and I'm not putting my borders on right away, then that's probably a good thing to do. And sometimes you can either you can do a basting stitch around the edge. Now when I'm sometimes when I'm putting it on a quilting machine or something, I do baste all the way around it. But it's a good thing to kind of secure those stitches so that they don't come out if you're not going to put the borders on right away.
So you almost stole my follow-up question to that, which was going to be the basting around the edges before you put it on a quilt machine. But so if you aren't, I know you have a long arm machine and that's what you quilt on, but if you're going to use a domestic machine, would you still baste all of your edges before you did any kind of quilting?
Well, if I'm doing it on my domestic machine, I would do some kind of basting anyway, or pin basting or something to hold it together. Yeah, because you're starting from the center and you're working out. So I think I wouldn't do it until I completely finished quilting the inside of it, and then I'd put a basting stitch around all of it. But I wouldn't do it first, because you're not allowing your the quilting to move as you're quilting. You've stopped your, I can't think of the words to say, but yeah, you don't want to do it before you're finished quilting.
Exactly. Otherwise, by the time you get out to that edge, you might have this big buckle of fabric that has nowhere to go. Yes, because you based it. So you mentioned on your regular sewing machine that you would always start center and work your way out. I know we've had guests on here previously too who have agreed with that same directional process, and others who have done something a little bit different where they just start at the top and move their way to the bottom, not necessarily starting in the center and working out. So what do you feel is the best way to do it, and why?
Their own way of doing things. Have you lost me again? Because you're frozen. Am I still here?
Oh, I got you. I hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, I mean, to me, if you work your way from the center out and you're going in through 4 different directions at a time, you're going to end up with a flatter surface. As if you work from the top down, you know, I don't know. You know, I mean, I've only quilted, after I quilted a couple quilts on my domestic machine, especially a king size quilt, that's when I decided to get a long arm, because I couldn't, it was too hard to quilt. I mean, I know a lot of people do it on their domestic machine, but I just found it too difficult. And it's not that I could afford a long arm or anything, but I mean, for my business, I bought it. So it makes things a little easier.
So what you're saying is, now that you've quilted with a long arm, there's no going back.
Yeah, there's no going back. I mean, I've done some miniature quilts. If I'm just quilting in the ditch, I've done miniature quilts on my regular sewing machine. And even then, first, and secure it in both directions before I start doing any other kind of quilting. Then that just keeps the quilting contained. It just keeps it from stretching in different directions.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. I use sewing pins on every seam, and sometimes I still end up with mismatched rows because my fabric has either stretched or moved. Is there a trick to avoiding this so I don't have to rip out my stitches?
Okay. It depends on where you're pinning. And if you have mismatched rows, it depends on how you've pressed your seams too. If you press your seams so that they butt, which means that you have one seam going one way and one seam going the other way, and when they come together, they kind of butt up against each other. And what I usually do is I'll put a pin in the front of that seam, not the back of it, the front of it, so it holds that seam together, and that keeps the seam from moving. But I know what you're talking about. Like I was talking about, fabric has different qualities to it. So then the other one, not lighter in color sense, but lighter in the fabric sense. It will stretch a little more than the others. So I always put a pin in at the back of my patch, at the front of my patch, and then I'll put a couple pins in the center and kind of ease all that fabric in. And that usually keeps it from moving around. If you're still doing that and there's mismatched rows, then check your cutting. I mean, you got to check all different things all the way back to the beginning of your block to make sure, find out why things aren't matching, because it might not just be the fabric, it might be other things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what if you are sewing maybe something a little bit more complicated of a block, whether you've got a flying geese coming together, so you've got points coming in, and you want to make sure that your rows stay matched up or your points align where they need to be. How do you pin those, or what do you do to make sure that everything stays aligned?
Well, I mean, I just add more pins. I mean, I'll pin, if I'm matching a center point, I'll put a pin in on each side of that center point to hold that center point together. I usually pull the seam down to see whether it's coming together where it's supposed to be, and then I'll put a couple pins in there. The more my fabric stretches, the more I want everything to match right, the more pins I'll add. I mean, I don't usually pin a lot, but I keep those areas together that I want to match.
You say, sorry, say that last part one more time.
I'll just put more pins in so that in specific areas, so those are the areas that I want to match. Like I do a lot of fussy cutting stuff and I want those fussy cut points to match. So I may use, 5, 6 pins in one little specific area just things to match. So you figure out how many pins are going to work out for you.
Perfect. So I was trying to get you to say something because I've seen you do it, and you're the first person I've ever seen do this. You basted first. You basted your quilt pieces together to make sure that your points were going to align. And I had never seen anyone do that before. I thought basting was a sewing only thing that I and my mom both tried to avoid at all costs. But you basted your quilt blocks. It blew my mind.
Well, I mean, I basted just the points because if my points don't match and I've sewed my whole seam, then I have to rip out too much. If I just based across where my points are matching and they don't match, then all I have to do is take out a couple little basting stitches and then reposition it and pin it again. So yeah, I mean, I will do basting just on those specific areas. That's what you're fishing for, I guess.
It was. I was trying to get you there without having to to have you, tell me how you baste, but we got there. Perfect. All right. You did mention fussy cutting. So if somebody has just heard that term and has never heard that term before, can you explain what that is and why you like it so much?
Okay. Well, fussy cutting, here I'm going to show a block here. See?
Perfect.
See this block here? Okay. This block is fussy cut. If you look at the back of it, you can see there's different pieces cut in there. And fussy cut just means that I've cut each of these little pieces here out of the same pattern in one fabric. Same thing with these pieces right here. I've taken a fabric, I've made a template, and I've cut those specific areas in the fabric with a template so that they all look the same. And then I sew them together. So that's what fussy cutting means. And you can do something simple, some simple fussy cutting where you're just taking a motif from a fabric and you want it in the center of a block. That's fussy cutting. So I'm just cutting one thing and I'm putting it in the center of the block because I want to feature a rose or some kind of motif in this fabric that would look good in the center of a block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to follow up on that, so I feel like the difference between, so when I first learned of fussy cutting, to me it was just cutting out the motifs only. And what you do for fussy cutting, I thought was only called kaleidoscope quilting. So is there a difference between kaleidoscope quilting and what you're doing in fussy cutting?
No, not really. I mean, you can, there's different ways to do it. There's stack and whack where you're stacking your fabric and you're cutting all the same area with one cut. Whereas when I'm doing fussy cutting, I'm cutting one piece at a time. And kaleidoscope is just a pattern. It's just a block name. And so you're creating a kaleidoscope look. A kaleidoscope just means, when you had a toy, you had that kaleidoscope toy and you look through it and you turned it and it creates a kaleidoscope. And it just means you're creating a design with the fabric that looks like a kaleidoscope, but there are kaleidoscope blocks. So yeah, it's basically the same thing. It's just different names for the same thing.
Yes. Yes. And if you want a more detailed look as to how Toby does her fussy cutting, she actually did a video for us for National Quilter Circle. We would have had it up already, but we had a little bit of a technical issue where we lost like the best shot, which showed you, because you use mirrors, right, when you do this, and we lost that shot. So we had to have you redo it, but it should be up on the site soon. But can you kind of explain how you use mirrors in quilting and cutting?
Yeah, that creates really interesting designs.
But how?
But how?
Yeah, I think I lost the first part of your explanation.
Okay, by using mirrors, you can look for designs in your fabric. So you can kind of see what your design's going to look like using the mirrors. So in this video, I show you how to use mirrors to look for designs, and then how to cut them out, and then how to create your own little kaleidoscope designs.
Yes, perfect. Another thing that I actually learned watching you, which is not something that I've ever done before. When I first started quilting, I had my rotary mat, my standard. I had 2 rulers that I only ever used, and I had a 45mm rotary cutter, and I never used any other size ever. But you actually use a different size pretty much every time I see you doing something. So what size do you use and why?
Well, I mean, I'll use a 45 occasionally if I'm millimeter, but I like using the 28mm or the 18mm, and that's only because I do a lot of template cutting, and I feel the smaller rotary cutters do better around templates than the great big rotary cutter. I have more control over them, so it just makes things easier. You don't have this great big blade that kind of wiggles around. I've never used the 60mm rotary cutter. It just has a great big blade that wiggles and wobbles, and you can't get a whole lot of control. Quilt shops use them for cutting through lots of fabric at a time. But for just general quilting, the 45, the 28, or the 18mm, I'll use depending on what I'm doing.
I think the only time I've used the 60 also is actually doing one of those stack and wax. So you have 6 or 8 layers all at one time that you're cutting, and that is, I think, the only time I've used that 60. When I use the smaller one, like the 20, it just feels so dainty. I feel like I'm going to break it. Like it's this tiny little cutter. So it takes a little bit of getting used to.
Well, if the 28 feels dainty to you, what does the 18mm feel?
Well, I've never touched it, so I don't know. I'll let you know if I ever do.
Okay.
So, but that's just a good tip to try out a bunch of different sizes of rotary cutters. You might find, like me personally, I don't like the small ones as much. I'm comfortable with the 45, but you might find, if you are someone who has struggled with, rotary cutting, whether that's templates or just your small pieces in general, and you've been using a 45, maybe try out these other sizes, and you might just find, oh, this is the perfect one for me, and that solves, all of your cutting issues. Perfect. All right. Well, so one last question here. I think we're about out of time, and I think we might be losing Toby to some weather issues again. But I want to know, if we back to the very beginning when somebody asked how you get into quilting or how you get started. We've talked a lot about multiple sizes of rotary cutters and things like that. But if you want to go and buy just the very basics you need to make a quilt or make a quilt block, what would that be?
Okay, well, you need at least a long ruler. I would recommend an 8.5 by 24-inch ruler. That's the best size. For general cutting, strip cutting, I usually get a square ruler, 8.5, 12.5 size square ruler to square up my things, and sometimes a smaller ruler, like a 6 by 6.5 by 12, to take to classes and stuff. Just to cut smaller things, you need a rotary mat. That's a one that is self-healing, and you need a rotary cutter, and you want to get a good rotary cutter that has a nice sharp blade in it, and be sure to get blade replacements, because
Well, I think we might have officially lost Toby to her inclement weather issues. I'm not really sure if she's going to pop back on here before we leave. Are you there, Toby? No, I think we might have lost her.
I,
Okay. Oh,
oh,
she's back. Okay. All right. So just to recap, in case she cut out for anybody else other than just me, maybe it was just me. I don't know. But just your basics, your rotary cutter, your rulers, and your cutting mats, and of course get some good fabric, and then you'll be well on your way to becoming a quilter. So those are your basics. That's how you get started in quilting. And then of course, join us back for all of these monthly live chats, and you'll get more tips and ideas of projects to make and things like that. But I want to thank everybody for being here watching, and Toby, of course, thank you for being here to answer everyone's questions.
Well, thank you for having me. I always enjoy